What if I told you that screwing up didn't have to keep you down? Like, you don't have to lay in bed thinking about the fact that you said you too when your waiter said, enjoy your food. Or the fact that you absolutely bricked the game-winning free throw. Or maybe that all of the online schooling with your children has made you realize you're not smarter than a fifth grader. What if I told you that everybody that you look up to is a total screw-up? That's right. Some are just better at hiding it. Some are better at owning it. But in every way, God can use all of it. So don't let screwing up keep you down.
Good morning. I'm Meredith Dankos. I'm the lead pastor here at The Well. Welcome if you are joining us for the first time. If you're joining us online or on the app, be sure to fill out our digital connect card. Let us know that you're here, how we can be praying for you. If you're here in person and you have the app, you can pull that out and fill out the digital connect card as well, and let us know how we can be praying for you also. So we're in our new series called Screw Up Word, and I want to be honest with you. Right at the start of this series, I spend most of my life trying really hard not to screw up, a lot. I mean, I tell people I regularly make a point of not looking stupid in any situation. I am a recovering perfectionist. I don't like making mistakes. I'm hard on myself when I make mistakes. And so when I first became a Christian, which was, later in life, it was a real paradox for me because it was such a relief to feel forgiveness for all the mistakes that I had made, all the ways that I had hurt someone or said something wrong, or all that. It was such a relief to know that I could be forgiven. And then I felt like, and now I must be perfect for God from here on out. Now that's all clean and clean slate, and now perfect. And so the first time I really screwed up after becoming a Christian, it really sticks with me because I was out with some friends and we were doing something. I was supposed to meet someone else and I didn't want to do that anymore. So I just called them and lied to them, told them my car broke down. And I know some of you are judging me already, oh, you lied. And I did, I lied. And I can tell you right away, I no longer had any fun with the people that I was with because I felt guilty for the rest of that time. I was like, I can't believe I just lied to that person. I went home and I looked up every single verse about lying that I could find. And I was like, Jesus, I'm so sorry. I'll try not to lie anymore. But in that moment, I learned something new about grace because becoming a Christian, I experienced the grace of past forgiveness. But in that moment, I realized, I need the ongoing reality of grace, which is why I have it tattooed on my wrist facing me on a daily basis to remind myself we start with grace. And so I learned in that moment that Jesus still loves me and accepts me and will still work with me even when I screw up, even when I mess it all up. And I'm in very good company because I assume that all of you at some point have screwed up as well since you've come to know Jesus. And Jesus thankfully built his church on a whole group of people who screwed up all the time. They messed it up. They didn't get it. They missed the point over and over again. If you read about the disciples, especially in the Gospel of Mark, they just really are dull and they don't know what's going on. And one in particular keeps popping up, and that is Peter. And Peter is this guy who just gets it wrong over and over. And Jesus says, you are who I'm going to build my church on. That is very good news for all of us in this room. And so for this series, we're going to be looking at the life of Peter, this disciple that Jesus singled out in a special way. And we're going to take great comfort that it's Peter, of all the disciples, that it was Peter that Jesus chose to build his church on. And so today we're going to look at two scenes from the life of Peter. And the first one shows up with the calling of Peter, the calling of Peter into becoming a disciple of Jesus. And we're going to look in the Gospel of Luke. If you have a Bible with you and you want to follow along, it's in Luke chapter 5. Otherwise, everything will be on the screen. And in Luke, Jesus has been around in the area that Peter lives. He's been teaching, he's been healing. In fact, right before this encounter, he has just healed Peter's mother-in-law. Peter isn't yet a follower of Jesus, but Peter is familiar with Jesus. And so Jesus is starting to gather this crowd around him as he goes and starts teaching, this following. And on this particular day, Jesus is teaching to this crowd of people and it just keeps growing and growing, and it gets so big that people can't hear him anymore. And so Jesus, being pretty inventive, he looks around and he sees two boats that are docked from the night of fishing, and they're working on their nets. And so he goes over to Peter's boat, he climbs in and he asks Peter to put out into the water because where Jesus is, it's a natural amphitheater. So if he speaks at his regular tone, everyone will be able to hear him. It naturally projects his voice. So Jesus is being really smart in that moment. And you're going to see in this passage, Peter is sometimes called Simon Peter, sometimes called Simon, sometimes called Peter, because his original name was Simon. Jesus named him Peter, and it just goes back and forth all the time in the Bible, and also just in this passage in particular. And so then Jesus says this to Peter. When he finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, who is Peter, row out further into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch. And Simon replied, Master, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing, but if you say so, I'll drop the nets. Okay, so Jesus tells Peter after all this teaching, go fishing. And Peter's a little bit hesitant to listen to Jesus. One, Jesus is not a fisherman. Jesus is a carpenter and a teacher. He doesn't fish for a living. Peter does. And so Peter's hesitancy is for good reasons. One, you don't fish during the day. You don't fish during the day because the fish can see the nets. The way that they fish, the fish would just swim around it and not get into it. So that's silly. Plus, Peter says, we've been working hard all night. And that word means to work wearisomely. Like they've been toiling all night and they came up with nothing. So they're tired, they're frustrated, and when Jesus encounters them, they're cleaning the nets. And so if they go out and listen to Jesus and put the nets back in the water, they're going to have to start all over again. So Peter is a bit reluctant here, but he turns to Jesus and says, well, I mean, if you say so, you're the boss, right? You say it, I'll do it. He's not like expectant, but he respects Jesus. Again, he's familiar with Jesus. He's had an encounter with Jesus. And so what we see with Peter is reluctant obedience here, reluctant obedience. He says yes, but he's not quick to do it. He's pretty slow to say yes. And then this happens next. So they drop the nets, and their catch was so huge that their nets were splitting. And they signaled for their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they filled both boats so full that they were about to sink. And when Simon Peter saw the catch, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, leave me, Lord, for I'm a sinner. So this catch that isn't supposed to happen, right? You're not supposed to catch one fish in the middle of the day. They catch so many that the nets are breaking, 2 boats are sinking. And Peter realizes this only happens because Jesus is here. This isn't something that would happen apart from Jesus. He recognizes who Jesus is. And in that moment, he falls before Jesus and he says, go away from me. I am not worthy. He recognizes his own sin. He recognizes how he's now in the presence of something bigger than he thought, because his language shifts here. Because when he first says to Jesus, yes, master, I'll do that because you say so. Master is like a term of rabbi. It's a term of respect. And afterwards he says, Lord, leave me. Lord, his language is shifted from master to Lord because he recognizes there's something holy and divine about what Jesus is about. He doesn't understand who Jesus is yet, but he knows this is bigger than what he thought. And in this moment where he feels so unworthy and so overwhelmed by the fact that he is a sinner and he doesn't get it right and his motivations probably weren't right and he was probably doubting this whole situation, what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, you're right, you're no good. Like, you doubted me. I just wanted to prove a point. Now I'm out of here. No, he says, actually, Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will be fishing for people. And as soon as they brought the boats to shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. So instead of chastising him or agreeing with him, Jesus draws him closer and says, you know what, you're going to be doing something different. You're going to be catching people. And that word fishing for people, that word fishing means to catch alive, to catch whole. So you're going to be catching people and bringing them into something bigger. You're going to be part of what I'm doing. Jesus meets him in his moment of unworthiness and says, actually, you're worthy. You're worthy to be part of what I'm doing. And we see that Peter's reluctant obedience helps him understand who Jesus is more. He moves from master to Lord. He leaves everything to follow him. And it doesn't count him out. It doesn't disqualify him because he was reluctant. And again, very good news for us, right? Because how many of us fall into reluctant obedience where we will say yes, but we are not quick to say yes. We are dragging our feet saying yes. And so here's how reluctant obedience shows up in our lives. The things that make us reluctant. When Jesus asks us to do something that's inconvenient, irrational, or intimidating. Inconvenient. Following the way of Jesus is not convenient. It is not efficient. It will mess up your time. Put yourself in Peter's shoes. Peter is at his workplace. This is what he does for a living. And Jesus shows up, who does not fish for a living, and is like, I know, we're going to do something a little different. We're not going to do it the way that you do it. We're going to do it the way that I think we should do it. So Jesus shows up into your workplace and he's like, we're not going to do it that way anymore. And you're like, I know, Jesus, I have it set. I know how my system works and my schedule works and who I talk to and who I don't and what meetings I go to. And Jesus comes in and messes it all up. That's kind of what's happened for Peter. Following Jesus can be incredibly inconvenient. Taking time out to talk to someone who's lonely, giving up your spot instead of keeping it for yourself, helping your friend move, putting your phone down to listen to your child, all of these ways that Jesus asks us to go out of our way to help other people, to not put ourselves at the center of our lives, but to put him at the center of our lives. It can be very inconvenient, and we can become reluctant to say yes when it impedes on our time, when Jesus asks us to go out of the way or do something that we're otherwise disinclined to do. And so when it feels inconvenient, we can be reluctant. When it feels irrational, we can be reluctant. So in this interaction with Peter, it's not just Peter who's in the boat. When he talks to Peter to pull out the boat, that is singular. But when he says put down the nets, that's plural. So Jesus is telling Peter, get your whole crew to do this crazy thing. All these people who work for you, they're going to do something crazy. You got to imagine that Peter's like, these people work for me. They look up to me like I'm their boss. Imagine if Jesus shows up in your job and starts telling you to do something crazy in front of people that are supposed to report to you, that are supposed to respect you and look at you for leadership and guidance, and suddenly you're doing something that you feel looks a little bit foolish. And we can be reluctant to do that. Kids in the room, eating with the unpopular kid rather than with all your friends, right? Choosing to go out of your way to include someone that everyone else doesn't include. Not always having the latest gadgets, not having the latest Apple Watch or iPhone, or even driving a really great car, like choosing to not invest in the things of this world, but use your money in other ways. Just giving your money away in general, giving away 10%. The world will look at you and be like, that is very foolish. That 10% could go into your retirement account, your Roth IRA, or whatever else. Invest it here for later. And instead, Jesus is like, go ahead, give 10 and then give more. Actually, give it all. Give as much as you can over and over again. That's irrational. And people will think that you are foolish if you use your money the way Jesus wants you to use your money. Holding to a radical sexual ethic in this world to say, I don't buy into the way that the world describes casual sexual encounters. I hold to a radical sexual ethic, the way that Jesus defines a sexual ethic, what it means to be in an intimate relationship within the confines of a covenantal relationship. Like that, I'm going to hold to that. People will think you're foolish. That's not the way it works. That's silly. Who gets into a marriage without experiencing that? Well, maybe we do. It can feel irrational following the way of Jesus. And so we can be reluctant to say yes to it. People can judge what you might do. And then when it feels intimidating, because Peter in that moment feels like, who me? I am not worthy. Jesus, flee from me because I am sinful. And Jesus pulls him in. And for us, sometimes the thing Jesus asks you to do, you think, who me? There's got to be someone else. I'm probably going to fail. I'm not moral enough. I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. I'm not smart enough. All these things that we say, not me. So who am I? That's the question we start to ask. Who am I? Who am I to mentor that student? Who am I to care for that person? Who am I to lead that team? Who am I? There must be someone else who's better than me than to do what you're asking me to do, Jesus. And so all these ways we can drag our feet. And we might say yes, but we don't say it expectantly. Peter isn't like, okay, cool, we're going fishing during the day, and the boats are going to sink. He's like, whatever, this is weird. Sure, we're going to have to redo our work again. We're going to have to wash the nets all over again after a night of not catching anything. But he still says yes, and Jesus uses that yes, and that's good news for us. But here's the thing with Peter. He doesn't just stay in the reluctant obedience. We also see that Peter sometimes is quick to say yes, sometimes a little too quick. So our next scene in Peter's life is also a boat scene. And so the disciples, some context here, the disciples have been following Jesus for a while. They've been hanging out with him, and they've seen all sorts of things. They've seen Jesus calm a storm that they were going to lose their lives in just with one word. They've seen him heal people, stand up to authorities. And this encounter that we're about to have, it's right after Jesus has fed the 5,000. This massive group of people with just morsels of food. He's fed tons of people with plenty left over. So they've been seeing Jesus at work. And Jesus sends them alone on a boat by themselves. And this is the first time that he sent them off to say, you go and I'll catch up to you. And so they're supposed to take the boat and cross the lake, and Jesus was going and praying by himself. And crossing that lake should have taken 1 to 2 hours. It wasn't a very far distance. Instead, it has taken them all night long. It has taken them over 8 hours to cross this lake, and they're still stuck. And so we read this. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, Jesus, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, it's a ghost. And they were so frightened, they screamed. And so again, they are in the middle of this storm, right? Their lives aren't at danger. It's not like, the boat's about to capsize, but they are working hard. They are exhausted. They are tired. There are no lamps, right? It's not like there's no light switch to flip on. The light is just beginning to dawn, and they see this figure walking on water. And they're not like, you know who that is? I bet that's Jesus. I bet Jesus is walking on water. People don't walk on water, right? They'd never seen Jesus do that. They think it's a ghost because they believed that deep water was where all the evil spirits lived. So they've been battling this storm, which they assume is the force of evil working against them. And now a ghost is coming to get them. That's where they're at, right? They are not in a good place. And what does Jesus say? He says this. He spoke to them and he said, be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. That word be encouraged means be of good cheer. Be of good cheer. They're in the middle of a storm. They've been rowing for 8 hours, right? And they think a ghost is coming to get them. Be of good cheer. It's me. And that word there, actually the phrasing of it is I am. It's the divine revelation. It's how God refers to himself all throughout the Old Testament. I am that I am Yahweh, right? So this is Jesus saying, I am God. Be of good cheer because I am the God who split the Red Sea. I am the God who delivered the Israelites out of slavery. It's me. So don't be afraid. Jesus is showing who he is. He's seen their distress over 3 miles away and made it to them on the water, okay? Then this is what happens. Peter's idea, right? Peter replied, Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. And as he began to sink, he shouted, Lord, rescue me. And Jesus immediately reached out, grabbed him, saying, you man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts? So I want us to pay attention here, be really clear. This was not Jesus's idea. Jesus did not say, hey, I'm walking on water, and if you really believe in me, you should get out of the boat and walk on water too. This is Peter's idea. Peter's like, hey, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water. And what does Jesus do? He's like, okay, sure, come on out in the water, right? And it's working. Peter is walking on water. Now, there's a big distinction between the word used for water for Jesus and Peter, right? So for Jesus, it's a lake, it's big distance. Peter, it's water. Like it's a much smaller distance than what Jesus is doing. And he's walking towards Jesus. Jesus is like, sure. He comes out. And then what happens though? He starts to see the wind and he starts to look around. He takes his eyes off Jesus and he starts to sink. I mean, picture that. He's not like you're on water. You don't just gradually sink. Like you're either on it or like he falls into the water and he's drowning and he calls for Jesus, please save me. And what does Jesus do? Immediately picks him up and rescues him. And he asks him this question, why did you begin to have doubts? And that word doubt means to be divided between two things, to be of two minds. And we see that, right? Like you're focused on Jesus and the waves. Like once you split your mind, once you split your attention, you started to drown. And what we see here, this picture, is what we would call impulsive obedience, right? Impulsive obedience, which is very quick to say yes, and sometimes not always to the right things. And again, Jesus, he is gracious to say yes to Peter's impulsive idea, and he is gracious to rescue Peter from Peter's impulsive idea. Very good news for us, right? Because we also can fall into impulsive obedience. And here are some of the factors that lead us to that. Impatience, inexperience, and insecurity. Impatience, inexperience, insecurity. Impatience. No one tells you how much waiting is in the Christian life. No one tells you how much you wait to discern and figure out what's next, and that God's voice isn't always clear. And so you wait and you wait and you wait until you don't want to wait anymore, and you start to get antsy and itchy, and what happens? That you begin to think, this thing came along right at the perfect time when I was so impatient I couldn't wait anymore, and so it must be the right thing. It must be what God has for me. And so we can be impulsive and jump on something that we think is right simply because we didn't want to wait anymore. And so we assumed it was the right thing. It was from God. We didn't necessarily get wise counsel. We didn't necessarily wait it out and test it. We just jumped right in, right? And we jumped right in. And sometimes we jump in and we are in over our head really fast, right? We start drowning too. And we're like, this is not the right thing. Jesus, please rescue me. Save me. I'm falling into the water. And so, we jump on the wrong team, the wrong job, the wrong relationship just because our patience ran out. And now I want to be clear. This is not because we're trying to be disobedient. Right? We're not trying to do something that God doesn't want us to do. We genuinely want to do what God wants us to do, but sometimes we don't wait long enough. We think that's enough waiting. I'm done. Now this is the right yes, because this is the yes that I want. We can talk ourselves into things. We can convince ourselves that it's the right thing, and we don't do our due diligence to actually sort it out and make sure. Another way is inexperience. And I have a friend who calls this the stupid tax. He says, don't pay it if you don't have to. If someone else can pay it for you, let them pay it. And so, but I've paid the stupid tax many times in my life where I've jumped into something and think, how bad could this be? I've done hard things. This won't be that hard. And then you're like, oh my goodness, this is really hard. Jesus, I am drowning. Please pull me out of the water. And you can see that with Peter. He's like, how hard could it be to walk on water if I'm walking with Jesus, right? He's doing it. I should be able to do it too. And so in experience, sometimes we don't bother to ask other people. We don't bother to ask someone who's already been in that situation or had that experience or maybe has more miles down the road. We just kind of jump in thinking, I got this. I got it. Or insecurity. And sometimes we are impulsive because we're trying to impress God or someone else. We're trying to prove something to ourselves or other people. We're worried that if something isn't happening, if I'm waiting too long, if I don't know the right thing, then people are going to think that I'm lazy or they're going to think that I'm worthless or that God has forgotten me or abandoned me. And so we start to feel worried and insecure and afraid. And so we jump on to something. In all of these ways, we, again, are seeking to be obedient. We're not trying to be outside of God's will, but we can be impulsive with our yes. I know before I took this job here, Steve and I had lost our jobs during the pandemic. And we were pastors, unemployed for 9 months during a pandemic when all the churches were closed. So I can tell you, impatience was definitely there. And insecurity of I'm never gonna do this again. But what am I gonna do? What job can I do now? I've been a pastor for so long. The grocery store won't even hire me, right? And then inexperience of I had never experienced so much rejection for jobs during that 9 months. But at one point, God was very gracious and said to me, listen, you are not going to know how to say no in this season. So I'm going to say no for you because you're just going to say yes to whatever it is. Because I was convinced every job interview, I'm like, this is it. I've already I'm looking on Zillow for where we're going to live and I've got it all planned out. And I know I can see all the problems, but no big deal. I can just jump into that. How hard could it be, right? And God was so gracious to not let me say yes to the wrong thing because I would have said yes, trying to be obedient, but I was feeling impatient and I was feeling worried. And so sometimes God will prevent us from being impulsive if we allow him. And other times, God will use even our impulsive decisions and work with them. Like when you started that business you shouldn't have, or you invested in this thing, or you took that role, or you joined this club, or whatever that is. You got all those things that you're like, I did not think that through. Nothing's wasted in the kingdom of God. Our impulsive obedience can even be used, and we can take comfort that even when we're quick to say yes, and maybe we say yes to the wrong thing, or maybe we haven't thought through what our yes is, God will still use it. God is still gracious to meet us in our decisions and gracious to help us get out of our decisions when we need to. And so with Peter, we have this picture of someone who's sometimes slow to say yes, sometimes quick to say yes. But in his saying yes, in each of these situations, he comes to understand who Jesus is more, and the people around him do too. And so for that first scene with the great catch, after he's like, go away from me, and all the boats are filled, what happens? Everyone around him is filled with awe. His language moves from master to Lord. He begins to see Jesus a little bit more clearly, and all of them leave everything in that moment to follow after Jesus. Because Peter reluctantly said yes to Jesus, everyone saw Jesus more clearly. And then when he was impulsive to say yes and the walking on water, all of the other disciples witnessed Jesus picking him up, rescuing him, and putting him safely into the boat. And what happens? They are filled with awe. They name him the Son of God and they worship him. So everyone around him begins to understand who Jesus is, all through these reluctant and impulsive yeses of Peter, because they're growing in trust and understanding. The thing that holds these two stories in common is they're both out in the deep waters. Jesus calls Peter out into the deep waters. And the deep waters for the Israelites, that's the source of chaos. That's where everything is out of control and anything could happen at any moment. Jesus brings them to the place where chaos lives, beyond what Peter can manage or handle or control or understand. And in there, Peter begins to see Jesus better. And so faith, when Jesus says to him, why is your faith so weak? Faith does not mean certainty. Faith does not even mean belief. It means trust. He says, why was your trust in me so weak? Why was your trust divided? Why were you not only focused on me, but instead you thought to trust something else or distrust something else rather than staying focused on me? And when he grows in trust, he also grows in understanding. Each time he gets a little bit clearer about who Jesus is. He sees him a little bit better. And so the thing with Peter is we see him slow to say yes, quick to say yes, but the important thing is he keeps saying yes. Over and over again, he says yes to Jesus. He lives a life of obedience, stumbling obedience, messing up obedience, but he keeps saying yes. And this is the thing, God doesn't require a perfect obedience. You're not going to get obedience perfect. Peter, who the church is built on, did not get obedience perfect. But what we need is a lifelong obedience. Eugene Peterson says it's a long obedience in the same direction. A long obedience in the same direction, to keep saying yes over and over and over to Jesus. And he says, in our culture, we desire immediate and casual. That's what we like, immediate and casual. And he says this, we assume that if anything can be done at all, it can be done quickly and efficiently. It is not difficult in such a world to get a person interested in the message of the gospel. It is terrifically difficult to sustain that interest. There is a great market for religious experience in our world, and there is little enthusiasm for the patient acquisition of virtue, little inclination to sign up for the long apprenticeship in what earlier generations of Christians called holiness. And so this long obedience, a life led of saying yes to God, of walking in God's ways. It's very easy to see the flashy grace of the gospel. You can be forgiven and everything's good and you get to go to heaven. Yay! But that's not what Jesus is signing us up for. He's signing us up for a long obedience, walking after him, becoming more like him. And Eugene Peterson says there's two great words to describe people who follow Jesus. The first is disciple, and we talk about this a lot here at the Well. That disciple does not mean expert. Disciple means learner. That's literally what the word means in Greek. Disciple means learner. And so to be a disciple is someone who is a learner after the way of Jesus. And it's not like taking a class, just getting a bunch of head knowledge. It's like learning a craft. And the more you learn a craft, the better you get at it. Your instincts get better. Your muscle memory gets better. That's what the image is of being a disciple, someone who's learning the craft of living the way of Jesus. And then the other word he says, it's like a pilgrim. And a pilgrim is someone who's going somewhere. They're traveling to a specific destination. They're not just wandering, they're headed somewhere. And he says, we're headed towards God, a life towards God, and the way of Jesus is the path to get there. That's what it looks like. And the best picture I can think of this idea of what does it look to have a long obedience in the same direction is this picture of a labyrinth. And so if you haven't picked one of these up yet, these are our memory verses for this series. We do one for every series, and our memory verses from 1 Peter 3:15. But on the other side is a picture of a labyrinth, and I love the labyrinth. Some of us look at this and we think it's a maze, right? But it's not a maze, because a maze, you can go the wrong way. A maze, you can turn the wrong way, and then you have to backtrack and figure out. But in the labyrinth, there's only one way in, and there's only one way out. That's it. And it's a steady walk towards the center where we meet with Jesus. And the thing about the labyrinth, though, is that it's windy. It's not straight. A long obedience in the same direction doesn't look like a straight path. It looks like a windy path that you have to pay attention to. And sometimes there are long stretches that feel like you're getting momentum. And sometimes there are places where you're like, I'm weaving. But in each one, we're still moving closer and closer to Jesus. And I think this looks like the path of a disciple. This looks like that long obedience in the same direction. And so Jesus doesn't need perfect obedience. He needs lifelong obedience. And so let this image carry you through this series to remind you that Jesus doesn't ask you to get it perfect. He just asks you to stick with it, just like Peter. And the most important words that Jesus says in both of these passages is, don't be afraid. In both of them. When Peter is at his lowest point, feeling like, go away from me, Jesus, I doubted and I didn't know that this was possible and I'm so sinful and who am I to be in your presence? He says, don't be afraid. And then when the disciples have been pulling at the oars for so long and they think that their life is now in danger and they are terrified, Jesus says, don't be afraid. Take great cheer. I am here with you. And so the comfort that all of us can take is that you don't have to be afraid in walking this path because Jesus is bigger than any mistake that you will make. Any reluctant obedience or impulsive obedience, anything where you drag your feet or you're just too quick to jump in, Jesus is there with you. He says, don't be afraid because nothing's wasted in the kingdom of God. You can screw it all up and he can still come along and make something out of it. That's the good news of the gospel. That's the good news that Jesus shows us, and that's the good news that Peter lives by. Let's pray. Gracious God,